When you think of the Roman Empire, you probably imagine its massive power and unbeatable legions. But what if I told you some of its most famous military blunders were not what you'd expect? Get ready for a journey through history that will make you question everything you thought you knew about Roman strategy. In this video, we'll explore not just the obvious mistakes, but also those that reveal the true nature of the Roman military and why they were considered genius at times and downright foolish at others. Let's start with one of the most infamous defeats in Roman history, the Battle of Cannae. The year was 216 BC, and the Romans had gathered one of the largest armies ever seen to confront their greatest enemy, Hannibal. But what happened next was something that shocked Rome to its core. The battle is known as one of the most catastrophic defeats ever for the Roman legions. But could this loss have been avoided? The Romans underestimated Hannibal's tactic. While Rome relied on sheer numbers, Hannibal played a different game altogether. He lured them into a trap with strategic brilliance that is still studied in military academies today. The Romans, believing their size alone would overwhelm Hannibal, were caught off guard by his flexibility. They relied too heavily on the idea that more soldiers equaled more strength. This is a classic mistake that even the mightiest armies have made throughout history. They didn't realize that victory isn't just about the number of soldiers. It's about the skill and strategy that drives them. The Roman commanders didn't adjust their strategy to account for the terrain and conditions around them. Hannibal, who knew the land intimately, used the environment to his advantage. He positioned his forces in such a way that the Romans, unable to maneuver effectively, were gradually surrounded. The Romans had a rigid strategy in place that they followed without considering their enemy's flexibility. They didn't adapt to Hannibal's clever encirclement, and it cost them dearly. What's even more mind-blowing is the aftermath of this defeat. It wasn't just a battle lost. It was a psychological blow to the very core of Roman confidence. The battle created panic in Rome, as citizens feared the complete destruction of their civilization. The loss shattered their sense of invincibility and set the stage for a series of disastrous decisions in the years to come. The Romans had always prided themselves on their military discipline and numbers, but here's the truth. They were blindsided by Hannibal's ability to think outside the box. His genius was not in brute force, but in his ability to understand the battlefield, the psychology of his enemies, and how to exploit their weaknesses. So, how did Rome recover? Well, overconfidence had a cost. Learning from its failure, adapted and eventually came up with new strategies that allowed them to defeat Hannibal in the end. But the story of Cannae is a stark reminder that even the greatest military might can fall when it becomes too rigid, too trusting of its own superiority. It was a humbling moment for Rome, one that turned the tide of history. There's something deeper here. Cannae wasn't just a mistake of military strategy. It was a failure in leadership. The Roman commanders didn't adjust when it mattered. They didn't listen to their scouts. They didn't innovate when facing an unconventional enemy, and they let pride dictate their decisions. It's a lesson that applies to any leadership role today. Never underestimate the power of adaptability. The fact that Cannae became one of the most iconic losses in history says a lot about the Roman mindset. Rome believed that their superior numbers and discipline would always carry them through. But Hannibal showed them something else, something we often forget when we think of military power. It's not always the biggest army that wins. Sometimes it's the smartest. Imagine what would have happened if the Romans had done their homework and understood that Hannibal was not just fighting with soldiers, but with tactics, intelligence, and deception. What if they had been more flexible? Would they have been able to avoid the catastrophic loss? This is the real question behind the Battle of Cannae, and it's a mystery that still puzzles historians today. The Battle of Cannae highlights the danger of overconfidence. The Romans believed they were invincible, and in that belief, they made fatal mistakes. They ignored the realities of battle and the strengths of their enemies, and in doing so, they lost not only the battle, but also their grip on the future. Could this one loss have been avoided? Absolutely, but it required a level of strategic thinking and adaptability that the Roman commanders failed to implement. Cannae teaches us that the most powerful empires can crumble not because of a lack of strength, but because of an inability to adapt. It was the beginning of a series of Roman military missteps, but also a turning point that would shape the future of warfare. The Romans would go on to learn mistakes, but the shadow of Cannae would loom large in the empire's history. The lesson was clear. Overconfidence and rigidity could doom even the greatest of powers. And for the Romans, this was the beginning of the end of their invincibility. But let's pause here and think about this. How often do we see this same mistake in our own lives? How many times have we been so sure of our own strength, our own knowledge, that we fail to recognize the value of flexibility and humility? The story of Cannae isn't just a military lesson. It's a life lesson. Never underestimate your opponents, and never become so sure of your own strength that you forget to adapt to the ever-changing battlefield around you. In the end, the defeat at Cannae wasn't just a blunder of military strategy. It was a blunder of pride. It was about more than just soldiers and tactics. It was about an entire empire believing in its own infallibility. And from that, we can learn a very simple but powerful lesson. Always be prepared to learn, to adapt, and to evolve. Whether you're leading an empire or just trying to navigate the challenges of everyday life, adaptability is key. By now, you should see how the Battle of Cannae, one of the most infamous military blunders in history, reveals something deeper about Roman strategy. Overconfidence, rigidity, and failure to adapt were the real culprits behind their defeat. The Romans didn't lose because they lacked strength. They lost because they failed failed to evolve. This story of Cannae isn't just about military failure. It's about the danger of thinking you're unbeatable, and that's something we can all learn from. How could a military genius make one fatal error that led to disaster? The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in the year 9 AD is one of those moments in history that seems almost too unbelievable to be true. Admiral Varus, one of Rome's most trusted commanders, led 3 Roman legions deep into what is now Germany, and they were lured into an ambush that would alter the course of Roman expansion. This loss wasn't just a minor setback, it was catastrophic, and it changed everything for Rome. But how did this happen? The Roman general Varus trusted the wrong allies, and he underestimated the Germanic tribes he was up against. What's truly remarkable about this story is the scale of the miscalculation. The Germans weren't just some ragtag group of barbaric tribesmen. They were skilled warriors, and they knew their land better than Varus knew his own. Varus believed that the Roman legions, with their superior organization and training, could handle any situation. But this belief was his downfall. The Romans were lured into an ambush in unfamiliar territory. The dense forested areas of the Teutoburg Forest offered a perfect setting for an attack that Roman commanders weren't prepared for. The Germanic tribes, led by the chieftain Arminius, who had once been a Roman ally, knew the forest intimately. They used this knowledge to set up traps, hide their forces, and outmaneuver the Romans at every turn. The Romans, so used to fighting battles on open fields, were out of their depth in the thick forest. Varus ignored critical warnings from his own scouts and soldiers. This is where things start to get truly tragic. Roman soldiers on the front lines began to voice concerns about the terrain and the unusual movements they were seeing in the forest. But Varus, confident in his ability to command and dismissive of what he perceived as small problems, chose to ignore these signs. It's almost as if he believed that nothing could go wrong until it did. When the ambush finally came, it was swift and brutal. Roman soldiers caught off guard and with little room to maneuver were slaughtered. The legions were decimated, and the survivors were either killed or taken as prisoners. For the Romans, it was a humiliation beyond imagination. The Romans had never been defeated in such a fashion. Trapped in a dense forest, without the chance to fight back effectively, consumed by shame, ended his own life shortly after the battle. A tragic end to a man who had once been considered one of Rome's finest generals. The failure to maintain proper supply lines made retreat impossible. Another crucial element of this disaster was the Roman military's reliance on their own strength and infrastructure. Rome had an impressive logistical system, but this didn't matter when their supply lines were cut off in the midst of a hostile environment. Once the ambush began, there was no retreat, no way to regroup. The Romans were essentially trapped in the forest with no chance of survival. The loss was so catastrophic that it forced Rome to rethink its strategy for expanding into Germanic territories. After the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, Rome never again attempted to conquer the Germanic tribes. The consequences were far-reaching as Rome turned its attention elsewhere, forever altering the course of its military history. What's fascinating about this story is not just the scale of the defeat, but also the realization that this could have been avoided with a few simple changes. Varus's overconfidence, his failure to adapt to new tactics, and his dismissal of intelligence from his own soldiers all led to the destruction of 3 legions. It wasn't just the loss of life, it was the loss of Rome's future ambitions in the north. So, what lessons can we draw from this disaster? The first is the danger of underestimating your enemies. The Germanic tribes weren't just barbarians. They were well organized and knew how to use their environment to their advantage. The Romans, who were so used to their disciplined legions and battlefield tactics, failed to recognize this. Had Varus taken the time to truly understand his enemy, things might have gone very differently. The second lesson is the importance of listening to your soldiers and scouts. These were the people on the ground, seeing the danger firsthand, and yet their warnings went ignored. Varus's failure to adapt to changing circumstances was his ultimate downfall. If he had adjusted his plans, listened to his men, and been more flexible, he might have avoided the ambush altogether. Finally, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest reveals the impact of overconfidence and rigid thinking. Rome had never faced such a defeat, and Varus's belief in the invincibility of the Roman legions led him to make critical mistakes. He thought that no one could stand up to Rome, but the reality was that his army was fighting on terrain that was beyond their control, and against a force that knew exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. This blunder was so significant that it left a lasting scar on Rome's military strategy. The Romans, once so sure of their superiority, learned the hard way that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. This lesson reverberated throughout history, influencing military strategies for centuries to come. You might be thinking, but surely such a mistake could have been avoided, right? Truth is, even the greatest military minds can make mistakes, especially when they're blinded by pride or the belief that they cannot fail. Varus's arrogance, combined with the failure to adapt, cost Rome dearly. But here's a thought that might surprise you. Could this loss have been a blessing in disguise for Rome? After all, the failure to conquer Germany meant that Rome's borders were never stretched too thin. Perhaps this loss, while devastating at the time, helped prevent Rome from overextending itself in the long run. It might have saved Rome from even greater disasters in the future. And that's where the story of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest leaves us, wondering how much of history's greatest defeats were not just about tactical errors, but about the overconfidence of those in charge. This battle, this one mistake, mistake reshaped the Roman Empire in ways we're still trying to understand today. The fate of the legions at Teutoburg wasn't just about one battle, it was about the lesson of underestimating your enemy, failing to adapt, and letting pride cloud your judgment. The consequences of these failures are still felt in history, but they also offer valuable lessons that we can all learn from today. The story of Teutoburg is a reminder, no matter how powerful you are never invincible. Was Crassus's downfall due to bad luck or poor judgment? The Battle of Cannae, fought in 53 BC, was one of the most disastrous defeats in Roman history, and it wasn't just a case of bad luck. It was a series of costly mistakes, poor leadership, and a failure to adapt to the realities of warfare. Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome and part of the first triumvirate alongside Pompey and Caesar, sought glory by taking on the Parthian Empire, a rival that Rome had long struggled with. At the heart of Crassus's fatal mistake was his underestimation of the Parthian cavalry, which played a key role in their military dominance. The Parthians were renowned for their horse archers, who could fire arrows with incredible accuracy while riding at full speed. Crassus, however, failed to account for this tactical advantage. The Roman legions, trained to fight in tight, disciplined formations, were not suited to counter the speed and mobility of the Parthian cavalry. Crassus's army was simply not prepared to face a foe that could strike from a distance and retreat before the Romans could even engage. As if that wasn't enough, Crassus made another critical error. He divided his forces. In a battle against a formidable enemy like the Parthians, this was a grave mistake. Crassus believed he could split his forces and use different strategies on different fronts, but this only served to weaken his position. His forces became fragmented and lacked the concentrated strength needed to fight the Parthian cavalry effectively. By dividing his forces, Crassus essentially set them up for defeat. What was meant to be a strategic advantage turned into a strategic blunder. Crassus also ignored critical intelligence about the terrain and the capabilities of his enemy. As the Roman army advanced into the Parthian heartland, they faced unfamiliar terrain that gave the Parthians an advantage. The Romans, who were used to fighting on more predictable landscapes, found themselves at a disadvantage in the desert plains. Crassus's failure to adapt to these new circumstances and to the specific strengths of the Parthian forces made the situation even worse. The result was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Crassus's army was decimated, with thousands of Roman soldiers killed or captured. The Parthian commander Charena used his cavalry to encircle the Roman legions, a tactic that took full advantage of the terrain and left the Romans with no way to escape. Crassus himself was killed in the aftermath of the battle. Some say he was executed by the Parthians, others that he died in battle, but either way his death marked the end of any hope for a Roman victory in the east. This catastrophic defeat at Carrhae had long-lasting consequences. It shattered Rome's confidence and crippled Crassus' reputation. Rome's dream of extending its empire into the Parthian Empire was dashed, and Crassus's failure made it clear that even the mightiest empire could be brought down by one poor decision. In the aftermath, the Parthians were emboldened, and Rome was forced to reassess its strategies in the east. What makes this defeat even more tragic is that it could have been avoided with a few changes in leadership and strategy. If Crassus had taken the time to understand his enemy's strengths and weaknesses, particularly the power of the Parthian cavalry, he might have prepared his forces differently. If he had maintained the integrity of his army rather than splitting it up, he might have been able to mount a more successful defense. And if he had adapted to the harsh desert terrain, his forces might have had a better chance of survival. The key lesson from Carrhae is the importance of adapting to the realities of warfare. Crassus's failure to understand the terrain, the enemy's tactics, and the limitations of his own forces cost him dearly. His overconfidence in his own military prowess led him to dismiss the challenges he faced, and that arrogance proved to be his downfall. It's a reminder that in military leadership, as in life, overestimating one's own strength and underestimating the challenges ahead can have catastrophic consequences. But the story of Carrhae doesn't just teach us about military blunders, it also teaches us about leadership. Crassus, despite his wealth and influence, lacked the flexibility and adaptability needed to lead his forces. To his overconfidence and failure to listen to his commanders and scouts, who had valuable information about the Parthian forces, sealed his fate. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, especially when it comes to leadership decisions that affect the lives of thousands. What's especially fascinating about this battle is the fact that, despite being one of the most powerful men in Rome, Crassus was still susceptible to the same mistakes that led to the downfall of countless leaders throughout history. His story highlights an uncomfortable truth. Power, wealth, and influence do not always translate into military genius or good decision-making. Sometimes, the most dangerous trait in a leader is not a lack of skill, but an overabundance of confidence in their own abilities. Crassus's failure at Carrhae also opened the door for the rise of a new power dynamic within Rome. Crassus out of the picture, Pompey and Caesar were left to vie for control, setting the stage for the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. It was one of those moments in history where a single defeat, born from poor judgment and overconfidence, had profound consequences that rippled through the fabric of Roman politics and military strategy. You might think that Crassus was simply unlucky, but the truth is, his downfall was the result of his own decisions. He was blinded by ambition and a desire for glory, and and in doing so he failed to recognize the real threats posed by the Parthians. His failure at Carrhae teaches us that sometimes even the most powerful individuals can make mistakes that will change the course of history. The lesson here is clear: never underestimate your enemy, always adapt to your surroundings, and above all, never let pride cloud your judgment. So was Crassus' downfall just bad luck, or was it poor judgment? The truth is, it was a combination of both, but more than anything, it was a failure of leadership. Crassus' overconfidence and inability to adapt to changing circumstances ultimately led to one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. And it's a reminder to all leaders, whether in battle, business, or life, that sometimes the greatest enemy isn't the one you're fighting, but the one within, your own ego. Could the Romans have prevented this shocking defeat so close to their own gates? The Battle of the Allia, fought in 390 BC, marks one of the most humiliating defeats for the early Roman Republic. The Gauls, under the leadership of Brennus, caught the Romans completely off guard, and this defeat would haunt Rome for generations. But how did this happen? How did a supposedly powerful military force, with years of military experience, get crushed so easily by an invading army? The Romans were caught off guard by an invading Gaulish army. The Gauls, a people from what is now modern-day France, were feared throughout the Mediterranean for their ferocity in battle. Rome, at the time, had grown accustomed to victory and believed itself to be invulnerable, especially against the unrefined tribes from the north. However, the Gauls were not just barbaric warriors. They were strategic, and their surprise attack shattered the Roman defenses. What's particularly shocking is the lack of proper intelligence and preparation on Rome's part. Poor intelligence and slow responses allowed the Gauls to strike quickly and decisively. The Romans were used to winning battles by engaging on their terms, on familiar ground, with well-prepared forces. But the Gauls moved swiftly, crossing the Alps and marching toward Rome in an unexpected way, catching the Roman commanders completely off guard. The lack of warning was a devastating blow to Roman confidence. The Roman leaders hesitated, making critical decisions too late. Once the Gauls reached the river Allia, they found the Romans in disarray. The leaders, paralyzed by indecision, failed to respond with the urgency required. They could have mustered a proper defense, but the delay allowed the Gauls to attack with full force. By the time the Romans reacted, it was already too late. As the Gauls swept through Roman defenses, the consequences were catastrophic. The Bamars destroyed Roman troops with shocking efficiency, and they went on to burn the city of Rome to the ground. The collapse was so rapid and thorough that the Romans had no choice but to abandon their city to the invaders. It was a humiliating moment, and the psychological impact was profound. Rome, once seen as an unstoppable force, was suddenly vulnerable, and its very existence was threatened. The aftermath of the defeat was nothing short of disastrous. Not only had the Romans lost their city, but the event caused lasting fear and humiliation. The Gauls didn't just conquer, they made an example of Rome. The Romans had to pay a hefty ransom to the Gauls in exchange for the city's release, but the damage was done. Rome's reputation was tarnished, and its people were left with a deep sense of shame. Here's where it gets fascinating. Despite the defeat, the Romans didn't give up. In fact, this humiliating moment would fuel their determination to rise from the ashes. They rebuilt their city, their armies, and their confidence. But it's clear that the Gauls exposed a significant flaw in Roman military strategy: overconfidence and lack of preparedness. What's even more interesting is that the Romans learned a crucial lesson from this loss. They became obsessed with defense and fortification, determined to never again let their city be so easily overrun. The defeat at the Allia, while devastating, was the catalyst that pushed Rome to develop the legendary strength and strategy that would make it a dominant power in the Mediterranean. But what does this defeat teach us? The Romans believed that their superior army and discipline would always guarantee victory. They were blindsided by the speed and unpredictability of the Gauls. It's a lesson that still rings true today. No matter how strong you are, you can always be outpaced by the unexpected. The Romans relied on their tried and true methods, but the Gauls disrupted that in a way that Rome was unprepared for. In military failure, the battle at the Allia exposed the danger of underestimating an opponent. The Gauls weren't the sophisticated, civilized enemy that the Romans had grown accustomed to defeating. They were unpredictable and fierce. Rome had failed to understand the nature of their enemy, and this ultimately led to their downfall at the Allia. It was a failure in judgment as much as it was in strategy. But there's something else to consider here. Could the Romans have prevented this defeat? The answer lies in their complacency. Rome's rapid rise had led them to believe they were invincible. They didn't prepare for a sudden, overwhelming attack, and their military strategies became rigid and inflexible. The Gauls were able to exploit this vulnerability, proving that even the most powerful empires are only as strong as their ability to adapt and anticipate threat. Rome's recovery from this catastrophic defeat is also a testament to their resilience. They didn't crumble in the face of adversity. Instead, they became more determined to strengthen their defenses and adapt their military tactics. They learned from their failures, which ultimately helped them create one of the most formidable empires the world has ever known. The consequences of the Battle of the Allia stretched far beyond that single defeat. Psychological impact on the Roman people was enormous. The event didn't just shatter their military, it shattered their sense of security. It also led to significant changes in how the Roman Republic prepared for future conflict. Overconfidence overconfidence and lack of preparation would no longer be tolerated. The Gauls had opened the eyes of the Romans to the fact that they could be defeated, and this realization, however painful, would ultimately drive Rome to greater heights. This battle also highlights the importance of leadership in times of crisis. The hesitation and delay in responding to the Gauls' advance were disastrous. The leaders' failure to act quickly and decisively cost Rome dearly. In the future, Roman military leadership would be marked by swiftness, adaptability, and the willingness to make difficult decisions in the face of danger. In the end, the Battle of the Allia was not just a disaster for Rome, it was a wake-up call. The Romans had believed they were invincible, but the Gauls shattered that illusion. It was a lesson in the dangers of complacency, in the necessity of preparation, and in the importance of never underestimating your enemy. And while this defeat would haunt Rome for generations, it would also shape the military strategies that would help them dominate the ancient world for centuries to come. So could the Romans have prevented this shocking defeat? Absolutely. They could have prepared better, responded faster, and adapted to the unique threat posed by the Gauls, but they didn't, and that failure led to a humiliating defeat that would shape Roman strategy forever. Did the Romans misjudge their greatest rival? The Punic Wars, particularly the Second Punic War, were a test of Roman strength and endurance, but they also exposed significant weaknesses in their military strategies. While the Romans were known for their disciplined legions and their ability to conquer vast territories, they were caught completely off guard by the genius of Hannibal, the Carthaginian commander. How did the Romans, despite their military might, fall into a pattern of miscalculation that would drag them into a war far longer than they anticipated? Hannibal's brilliance in battle was underestimated by Roman commanders, and this misjudgment would cost them dearly. The Romans initially failed to comprehend just how formidable Hannibal was as a strategist. He was able to cross the Alps with an army, including war elephants, in one of the most daring military feats in history. For the Romans, this was an unimaginable maneuver, one that was so shocking they could hardly believe it when they learned of it. They thought that no general could outthink the Roman machine, but Hannibal proved them wrong time and again. But it wasn't just Hannibal's boldness that took the Romans by surprise. It was their own arrogance. The Romans, so accustomed to dominating on land, failed to adapt quickly to the Carthaginians' ability to maneuver strategically and outflank them. At the Battle of Cannae, for example, the Romans sent their massive force to meet Hannibal head-on, believing that sheer numbers would ensure victory. But Hannibal's tactical brilliance, using the terrain in a clever double envelopment strategy, decimated the Roman army, inflicting one of the worst defeats in their history. The Romans underestimated Hannibal's strategic use of the environment, thinking that terrain could never be a major factor in a battle. This error left them reeling. The Roman response to Hannibal's victories was slow and misguided. The Roman generals initially ignored the importance of naval warfare. They had focused almost entirely on land battles, assuming that control of the Mediterranean was theirs by default. Carthage, however, had a superior navy that was crucial in maintaining supply lines and outmaneuvering the Romans. The Romans failed to see the bigger picture. Hannibal's brilliance didn't just lie in land warfare, but in his ability to control resources, which is often the true key to a prolonged military campaign. Rome's initial strategy, built on brute force and unshakable confidence, faltered in the face of Hannibal's adaptability. The Romans made several mistakes: their overconfidence, their failure to adjust to Hannibal's unorthodox tactics, and their lack of response to Carthaginian naval superiority. In the long run, the Romans were forced to adopt a strategy that was the complete opposite of their previous approach. They avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal and instead targeted Carthage itself. This shift in strategy ultimately led to Roman victory, but only after significant losses and a prolonged conflict. One of the strangest facts about the Punic Wars is that, despite their eventual success, the Romans had to endure incredible hardship. After the disastrous loss at Cannae, Roman society was thrown into turmoil. The Senate was in disarray, and panic spread through the streets of Rome. Yet, the Romans managed to maintain their resolve and adjust their tactics. This ability to bounce back from near defeat became one of Rome's defining features. What's even more fascinating is the long-term impact the Punic Wars had on Rome's military strategy. The wars taught the Romans the importance of adaptability in warfare. Their failure to anticipate Hannibal's moves and their initial lack of a proper response to Carthaginian naval strength was a lesson that would shape Roman military doctrine for centuries. But there's an interesting irony here. Rome's victory in the Punic Wars didn't come from brilliance on the battlefield. It came from their ability to adapt and learn from their mistakes. True genius of Roman military strategy came from their ability to evolve, even in the face of devastating losses. But what does this tell us about the nature of warfare? It's not always about winning the battle at the time. It's about learning from your mistakes and adapting. The Romans' victory in the Punic Wars wasn't inevitable, and it certainly wasn't because of their initial superiority. It was because they were able to shift their approach when things went wrong. They didn't just rely on their strengths. They adjusted their strategies, learned from their mistakes, and waited for the right opportunity. The Punic Wars also shed light on one of Rome's greatest flaws: the inability to anticipate and respect their enemies. Hannibal was not just a military genius. He was someone who understood Roman psychology. He exploited their overconfidence, and they fell right into his trap. This is a hard truth for the Romans to face, but it's a lesson we can learn as well. Sometimes our biggest weaknesses lie in the places we're too proud to examine. In the end, the The Romans had to deal with the consequences of their misjudgment, and they paid a high price for it. But even with all their setbacks, the Romans came out victorious in the end. It's almost a miracle they won, considering how poorly things went early on. But Rome's ability to learn, adjust, and rebuild after such devastating losses allowed them to eventually conquer Carthage. And even though the Punic Wars were costly, the Romans' ability to recover and ultimately win showed the resilience and determination that would define them for centuries. So, did the Romans misjudge their greatest rival? Absolutely. They failed to see the full scope of Hannibal's genius and underestimated Carthage's naval capabilities. They made critical errors in their initial strategies, and those mistakes nearly cost them everything. But what made Rome truly great was their ability to adapt, learn, and push forward despite overwhelming odds. The Punic Wars proved that even the greatest empires can make huge mistakes, but it's how you respond that makes the difference in the end. In the next sections, we'll see how Rome learned from these errors and the long-lasting effects the Punic Wars had on their military strategies. They may have misjudged Hannibal, but their ability to recover from defeat would lead them to unprecedented power. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into one of the most significant military blunders in Roman history and how it set the stage for Rome's future military successes. How did the mighty Roman Empire fall to a seemingly less advanced foe like the Goths? The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD was one of the most crushing defeats for the Roman Empire, marking the beginning of its slow and inevitable decline. But how did it happen? How did the Romans, with their superior technology, strategy, and seemingly unbeatable legions, fall victim to an enemy they thought was inferior? It all started with the Romans underestimating the power of the Goths. For centuries, Rome had built its empire on the backs of disciplined legions, superior infrastructure, and military technology. The Roman generals believed that their old tactics, based on solid formations, disciplined infantry, and extensive fortifications, would work against any enemy, including the so-called barbarian tribes. However, the Goths, who were far from unorganized or underprepared, had learned from their previous encounters with Rome. They were ready. The Roman Empire, at the time, was already in decline. Its legions, once the epitome of military discipline, were no longer the invincible force they once were. They were spread thin, defending an ever-expanding empire from all sides, and this led to internal strife and political instability. The Gothic tribes, initially invited into Roman territory as refugees, were poorly treated and mistreated by Roman authorities. This treatment only served to strengthen the resolve of the Goths, who were led by their fearsome king, Fritigern. When the Roman Emperor Valens faced the Goths at Adrianople, the battle that followed was disastrous for the Romans. Valens, in an attempt to end the Gothic threat quickly, underestimated their strategic capabilities and attacked without waiting for reinforcements. The Roman legions, caught off guard by the mobility and tactics of the Goths, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Now, here's where things get truly surprising. Roman commanders, despite their previous successes, failed to adapt their strategies to the evolving nature of warfare. The Goths, rather than engaging in traditional line-to-line combat, used clever tactics like flanking and cavalry maneuvers to break the Roman lines. The Roman legions, still relying on their old strategies, were caught off guard and struggled to adapt to the Gothic style of warfare. The Goths' superior use of cavalry, in particular, made a significant impact. While the Romans had great infantry, they were not prepared for the speed and power of the Goths' mounted warriors. The failure to recognize this shift in combat style was a massive mistake for the Romans. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the Roman formations were being torn apart. With little room to maneuver, the Romans became trapped in the chaos of battle. What followed was a catastrophic defeat. The Romans were slaughtered, and Emperor Valens himself was killed in the battle. This loss had far-reaching consequences, as it not only signaled the decline of the Roman military's dominance, but also marked the beginning of the Goths' rise. The aftermath of Adrianople was even more significant than the battle itself. The defeat led to a massive blow to Roman morale and the security of the empire. For the first time in centuries, the Romans realized that they were not invincible. In fact, the defeat at Adrianople is often cited as one of the key turning points in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Goths, emboldened by their success, went on to push further into Roman territory, and their raids would continue to destabilize the empire in the years to come. So, how did this defeat change the Roman Empire? The Roman generals, who had once prided themselves on their superior tactics, now found themselves struggling to keep up with the changing nature of warfare. The traditional Roman military structure was no longer sufficient to counter threats like the Goths, who were adaptive, flexible, and increasingly skilled in new forms of combat. The defeat at Adrianople exposed the Roman army's weaknesses that had been masked by their past successes. The Romans had grown complacent, relying too heavily on their old ways without adapting to the changing world around them. It's also important to note the role of leadership in this debacle. Emperor Valens' decision to fight without waiting for reinforcements was a disastrous one. His overconfidence, coupled with the Roman leadership's inability to adapt to new tactics, led directly to their defeat. Valens' lack of caution and foresight in preparing for the battle contributed to the loss, showing how leadership missteps can turn the tide of battle in favor of the enemy. But here's the kicker. Even though the Romans were defeated, they didn't give up. The Battle of Adrianople may have been a disaster, but it was a wake-up call. It forced the Romans to rethink their strategy strategies and reconsider how they viewed their enemies. Over the next several decades, the Roman Empire, though fractured, made efforts to learn from its mistakes and adapt. Unfortunately, it was too late. The empire's internal struggles, coupled with the external threats, would eventually lead to its collapse. The defeat at Adrianople serves as a cautionary tale of what happens when a once dominant force fails to adapt and respect its enemies. It's a harsh reminder that military success is not just about power, but about the ability to change, innovate, and learn from mistakes. The Romans were once the masters of military strategy, but in the face of new challenges, they stumbled. Their defeat at Adrianople proved that no empire, no matter how great, can survive if it fails to evolve. This raises an interesting question. How often do we see this pattern in modern times? Empires rise and fall, but the key to longevity is not just strength but adaptability. The Roman Empire at its height was unmatched, yet it ultimately fell because of its failure to adapt to new forms of warfare, new technologies, and a changing world. So, how did the Romans fall to the Goths? Through a mix of complacency, poor leadership, and an inability to adapt. This battle, this pivotal defeat, changed the course of history and set the stage for the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. But the story of Adrianople also serves as a powerful reminder. Never underestimate the power of adaptability in warfare and in life. The Romans learned a hard lesson that day, but they weren't alone. It's a lesson that we can all take to heart, especially when we face challenges that seem insurmountable. The key is not to fight the old battles with outdated strategies, but to be flexible, to adapt, and to learn from past mistakes. Because the true enemy is not just external, it's also internal complacency. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the other Roman military blunders that contributed to the fall of one of the greatest empires in history. Was Caesar's victory at Pharsalus a brilliant tactic or a reckless gamble? In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar found himself facing off against one of the most powerful and influential military leaders of his time, Pompey the Great. It was a battle that would decide the fate of the Roman Republic and the course of history itself. Caesar, with a smaller, less experienced army, stood against Pompey's forces, which outnumbered his own. And yet, against all odds, Caesar won decisively. At first glance, it might seem like a clear example of military genius. But was it really? Was Caesar's victory at Pharsalus the result of carefully crafted strategy? Or was it simply a daring gamble that paid off? The answer is not as clear-cut as history often presents it. Here's where things get interesting. Most people believe that Caesar's success at Pharsalus was inevitable, that his tactical brilliance was what led to the victory. But the truth is far more complicated. Caesar's army was heavily outnumbered, and Pompey's forces were far better supplied and trained. So how did Caesar manage to defeat Pompey with such a risky strategy? The key lies in the tactics Caesar used on the battlefield. He was known for his ability to think outside the box, to surprise his enemies with unconventional methods. At Pharsalus, Caesar's army used a strategy that was unexpected and risky, relying on the element of surprise to break Pompey's much larger force. Caesar's troops, though fewer in number, were highly motivated and experienced. They had fought with Caesar in Gaul and had developed a deep trust in their leader. This sense of unity and loyalty played a crucial role. Caesar knew that in order to win, he needed to make the battle personal for his soldiers, to remind them that their fate was intertwined with his. On the other hand, Pompey's army lacked the same level of cohesion. Despite their numerical advantage, Pompey's forces were divided in their loyalty and had little faith in their leader. Pompey hesitated, unable to make the bold decisions necessary to secure victory. His reluctance to engage decisively, combined with Caesar's swift and unexpected tactics, led to the collapse of Pompey's forces. But here's where the story gets even more intriguing. The battle wasn't entirely a flawless display of Caesar's genius. In fact, it could have easily gone the other way. Caesar's forces were at risk of being outflanked and overwhelmed by Pompey's cavalry, and at one point during the battle, it seemed like Pompey might gain the upper hand. Caesar's quick thinking and his ability to read the battlefield, however, allowed him to adapt to the changing circumstances and turn the tide in his favor. Pompey, meanwhile, had no such flexibility. His decision-making was slow, and he failed to capitalize on the advantages he had. Instead of striking hard at the heart of Caesar's army, he hesitated, allowing Caesar's forces to regroup and retaliate. Pompey's army was routed, and Caesar's victory was secured. But was this a victory built on brilliance, or was it simply luck? It's hard to say. Caesar's strategy was bold, yes, but it was also incredibly risky. Had Pompey made the right moves, had he been more aggressive, the outcome could have been very different. Caesar was lucky that Pompey's hesitation allowed him to exploit weaknesses in the Roman army, but at the same time, Caesar's ability to think on his feet, his understanding of his soldiers' strengths, and his willingness to take risks were key factors that led to his success. The battle's aftermath is just as important as the battle itself. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus solidified his power and led to the downfall of Pompey. Pompey, once a powerful figure in Roman politics, fled the battlefield and ultimately met his end in Egypt. Caesar, on the other hand, returned to Rome as the undisputed leader, setting the stage for the eventual transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. However, Caesar's victory came at a great cost. His gamble, his bold tactics, and his willingness to risk everything in the name of victory made him a hero to some and a tyrant to others. His actions at Pharsalus set the stage for a civil war that would ultimately lead to the end of the Roman Republic. In the years that followed, followed, Caesar's rule would be marked by controversy, political intrigue, and the rise of the Roman Empire. Was Caesar's victory at Pharsalus a brilliant tactic or a reckless gamble? The truth lies somewhere in between. It was both. Caesar's unconventional tactics and his ability to surprise his enemies played a crucial role in his success, but it was also a gamble that could have easily gone wrong. In the end, Caesar's victory was determined by a combination of strategy, luck, and the willingness to take risks. This battle is a perfect example of how military success is often determined by a combination of factors, some within the control of the commander and others outside of it. It also highlights the importance of adaptability in warfare. Caesar was able to think on his feet, adjust his strategy as the battle unfolded, and ultimately secure a victory that would change the course of Roman history. What does this teach us about warfare, leadership, and decision-making? It shows us that success often depends on our ability to take calculated risks, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to learn from the unexpected. Sometimes, the greatest victories come not from flawless planning, but from the ability to seize opportunities when they arise. In the end, the Battle of Pharsalus was not just a victory for Caesar, it was a reminder of how powerful the combination of boldness, flexibility, and decisive action can be. And while it may have been a gamble, it was a gamble that paid off, shaping the future of Rome and the world. Did the Romans waste a golden opportunity for conquest? As Julius Caesar pursued Pompey the Great across the Mediterranean, he found himself presented with an intriguing, yet often overlooked opportunity. When Pompey fled to Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus, Caesar was already on his heels. But in his pursuit of revenge and the pursuit of Pompey's forces, Caesar missed an incredibly strategic opportunity, the chance to fully secure Egypt for the Roman Empire. Now, many might assume that Caesar's focus on Pompey was justified. After all, Pompey was one of the most formidable political and military figures of the time, and Caesar was on a quest to solidify his power in Rome. However, what if Caesar had turned his attention toward Egypt instead? It could have dramatically altered the course of history, not just for Caesar but for Rome itself. But why didn't he act? As we delve deeper into this period, you'll discover how Caesar's decision-making reflected a combination of personal ambition, political motives, and the unpredictable nature of Roman warfare. To understand the missed opportunity fully, we need to understand the political situation in Egypt. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, was locked in a power struggle with her brother Ptolemy III. She sought to solidify her position and had already made an alliance with Caesar, one that would later lead to their famous romance and the birth of Caesarion, Caesar's son. At the time, Egypt was incredibly wealthy, a key center of trade and power in the Mediterranean world. Securing Egypt would have provided Caesar with vast resources and further cemented his control over the east. The problem, however, was Caesar's singular focus on Pompey. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, Pompey had already been assassinated, decapitated in fact. Pompey's death was a blow to Rome's political landscape, and Caesar was determined to ensure Pompey's legacy was wiped out. He wanted to avenge his rival's death and showcase his dominant style, but in doing so, he missed a rare opportunity to fully integrate Egypt into the Roman sphere of influence. Had Caesar decided to act sooner and direct his full attention toward Egypt, there is little doubt that he could have taken the entire region under Roman control. Egypt's importance could have bolstered Caesar's political standing, and instead of being distracted by the murder of Pompey, he might have expanded Rome's territory significantly. However, Caesar's delayed focus on Egypt allowed internal politics to intervene. By the time he was able to turn his attention to Egypt, he found himself embroiled in the complex political dynamics between Cleopatra and her brother. What makes this situation even more intriguing is the fact that Egypt's political instability at the time played directly into Caesar's hands. Cleopatra, knowing that her brother's forces were on the brink of collapse, invited Caesar to support her. Had Caesar fully committed to her cause right away, Egypt could have been under Roman control much sooner, and the entire Mediterranean world might have looked different in terms of Roman influence. Instead, Caesar's initial focus on revenge and his delay in securing Egypt led to a protracted struggle. The famous siege of Alexandria followed, where Caesar found himself surrounded by Egyptian forces. At one point, his situation became so dire that his forces were nearly overwhelmed. It was only through a combination of luck, timing, and sheer resolve that Caesar managed to escape the precarious situation and solidify Cleopatra's position as queen. The ramifications of this delay were significant. While Cleopatra and Caesar's alliance ultimately benefited both parties, with Rome gaining Egypt as a client state, the initial delay cost Rome a golden opportunity to bring Egypt fully into its fold sooner. Instead of a quick conquest, Rome had to navigate years of political maneuvering and diplomatic strife. Caesar's delay in acting quickly may have ultimately helped establish the political and military chaos that followed his assassination and contributed to the eventual rise of Augustus, who would go on to formally annex Egypt after Caesar's death. Let's not forget the fact that Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra itself led to even more controversy. While the alliance was a political one, the personal aspect, especially the birth of Caesarion, had significant implications. Some historians argue that Caesar's personal interests and desires interfered with his strategic thinking, leading him to miss the opportunity of securing Egypt sooner. While this alliance with Cleopatra solidified Caesar's image as a global power, it was not not the swift conquest that could have secured Rome's dominance in the east much earlier. Many believed that Caesar's delay was a sign of his overconfidence, thinking that the conquest of Egypt would remain on his terms. He felt the time would come when he could integrate Egypt into the empire in his own way. But the reality is, by the time he was able to bring Egypt into the Roman fold, much of the political energy that could have gone into the early conquest was wasted in back-and-forth struggles and negotiations. The story of Caesar's missed opportunity in Egypt is a great reminder of how timing can drastically affect the course of history. Sometimes, the moment of greatest opportunity passes by because of distractions, or in Caesar's case, personal ambitions. Had he focused on Egypt first before Pompey's death became his obsession, the power dynamics of the ancient world could have shifted in favor of Rome much faster. You might be wondering, what could Caesar have done differently? First, his reaction to Pompey's assassination was understandable, yet it blinded him to the strategic advantages that an early conquest of Egypt could have brought. Had Caesar put aside personal vendettas and acted more decisively on the political landscape before becoming entangled in the drama of Pompey's death, Rome might have experienced a very different trajectory. His decision set a precedent for the next Roman leaders to follow, and the future of Egypt would not be decided by Rome's internal struggles, but by a more unified, proactive empire. In the end, while Caesar's reign is often remembered for the great successes he achieved, this missed opportunity in Egypt highlights the importance of timing, focus, and decision-making. His legacy is undeniably powerful, but it also shows that even the greatest leaders have moments where they could have done more, faster, and with greater precision. The Battle of the Sabus was supposed to be an easy victory for the Romans. General Caesar, one of the most renowned military leaders in history, led his forces to the Gallic territories to face a relatively smaller enemy. But this battle, which would become a blemish on Caesar's otherwise impressive career, showed just how quickly overconfidence can lead to disaster. Caesar's army was one of the most powerful military machines in the world, with experience and discipline unmatched by most of their enemies. Yet, in the Battle of the Sabus, the Romans fell prey to a series of blunders that turned the tide in favor of their opponents. What went wrong? At the heart of the problem was Caesar's overconfidence. The Romans, used to overwhelming their enemies with sheer size and strength, underestimated the tactical genius of the Gauls. Caesar's legions were stretched thin as he failed to fully coordinate his forces, leaving parts of his army vulnerable to attack. Caesar's leadership was under strain, and the failure to communicate properly with his subordinates would prove disastrous. As the battle unfolded, the Romans were surrounded by enemy forces that took advantage of their disarray. The unexpected ambush caught them off guard, and Caesar's trusted army was no longer in control. His forces were too scattered, and without a unified front, they were left open to surprise tactics and relentless attacks. While the Romans did manage to retreat, they suffered heavy casualties. The arrogance of believing that their military prowess alone could carry them through any battle led to strategic blunders, and it wasn't just the physical loss that hurt them. The Disastrous undermined Caesar's confidence and tarnished his invincible reputation. Here's a rare fact. After the Battle of Sabus, the Romans began to rethink their approach to military leadership. Caesar, despite his usual brilliance, was forced to reflect on the limits of overconfidence and how crucial it was to never underestimate an enemy, even one that seemed inferior at first glance. It wasn't just the battle that was lost. Caesar's own understanding of Roman military strategy was challenged. Would he bounce back? Absolutely. But Sabus marked the point where Caesar truly learned the value of proper coordination and the importance of never assuming that victory was assured. What makes this situation even more fascinating is how Caesar, the man who would go on to become one of Rome's greatest leaders, would emerge from this failure even stronger. Despite the setbacks, he adjusted his strategy, ensuring that future battles would never fall into the same pattern of overconfidence. He learned the hard way that no matter how experienced or talented a general is, failure to adapt to the specific circumstances of each battle could lead to a disastrous outcome. The lesson here is a sobering one. Overconfidence, no matter how justified, can be the fatal flaw that topples even the greatest leaders. The Battle of the Sabus serves as a reminder that any military force, no matter how powerful, must be constantly vigilant, flexible, and open to rethinking strategies. The Romans, one of the most successful empires in history, ultimately paid the price for a failure in leadership and strategy. Caesar's defeat at the Sabus was a setback, but it was also the moment that shaped his future decisions and ensured that he would never again underestimate the complexity of military strategy. In the end, this battle wasn't just about military tactics, it was about leadership and humility. The Romans were humbled, and Caesar's future victories were built on the lessons learned at Sabus. It was a painful, costly experience, but in many ways it marked Caesar's growth as a general and a leader. The battle, though a failure, showed Caesar how important it was to never assume that a win was guaranteed, and how to turn that realization into future successes. How did the Romans miscalculate their rivals in the east? The Macedonian Wars were supposed to be just another conquest for the Romans, but they failed to recognize the true strength of their opponents. At the time, the Macedonian kingdom seemed like an outdated power, perhaps easy to overcome given their reputation. However, the Romans severely underestimated their rivals, setting the stage for some embarrassing defeats. In the early stages, the Romans viewed the Macedonians with disdain. They were entrenched in the old military tactics of the phalanx, which appeared rigid and outdated compared to the Romans' more flexible legion formations. Most people think that because the Macedonians were using a formation that was known to be used in Alexander the Great's time, they were no match for the Romans' innovation and strategy. The reality, however, was far different. The Macedonian phalanx was still a formidable force when used properly, and the Romans failed to adjust their tactics to address this specific threat. One of the major miscalculations the Romans made was failing to appreciate the tactical flexibility of the Macedonian army. The Roman generals stuck to their standard methods, believing they could overpower their enemy by simply deploying their legions in typical Roman battle formations. However, the Macedonian generals, like King Perseus, adapted quickly and used their terrain to their advantage, making it difficult for the Romans to respond effectively. In one particular battle, the Romans were caught off guard by a feigned retreat, an old trick used by the Macedonians to lure the Roman legions into an ambush. The Romans, overly confident in their ability to win through sheer force, rushed forward without considering the terrain or the possibility of an ambush. The result, a disaster that cost the Romans dearly and left them questioning their approach. Here's a rare fact: despite the Romans' earlier successes, they were forced to go back to the drawing board after these humiliating defeats. The Romans had to rethink their entire strategy for dealing with the Macedonian threat, realizing that brute force wouldn't always secure victory. The Romans learned that not all enemies could be defeated by simply overwhelming them with numbers. The Macedonian kingdom, with its disciplined phalanx and ability to maneuver in battle, demanded a more nuanced approach. This series of wars ultimately helped set the stage for Rome's dominance in the east, but it also served as a cautionary tale. The Romans had learned that their military superiority wasn't a guarantee, and their failure to adapt to new military strategies had led to unnecessary losses. They could no longer rely on their old tactics, but had to adjust their methods in order to defeat this more challenging opponent. The lesson from the Macedonian Wars is clear. Failing to understand and adapt to the unique strengths of your opponents can lead to catastrophic mistakes. The Romans, usually known for their military genius, had to learn the hard way that innovation is crucial in warfare, especially when facing an adversary who wasn't following the same old playbook. It's a bit controversial to think that the Romans, who were known for their strategic brilliance, could make such mistakes, but history shows that even the greatest armies can fall into the trap of arrogance. The Roman Empire's success wasn't guaranteed just because of its sheer size or strength. It was ultimately their ability to adapt that allowed them to conquer so much of the known world. The Romans did eventually emerge victorious in these wars, but it wasn't without first suffering significant setbacks. Their victory came at a great cost, and after a great deal of reflection and adaptation. In the end, the Macedonian Wars proved to be one of the most important lessons in Roman military history, showing that even the greatest military power must remain vigilant and adaptable to new and evolving threats. Did the Romans waste a golden opportunity for conquest? When Caesar pursued Pompey's forces, he ignored a prime chance to expand into Egypt. His obsession with revenge and his personal rivalry with Pompey clouded his judgment. He missed a crucial opportunity to push deeper into Egypt, a land that could have been seamlessly incorporated into the Roman Empire, an empire that was already spreading across the Mediterranean. Most people think that Julius Caesar, a man known for his brilliance and strategic mind, never passed up an opportunity to expand Rome's borders. But the reality is that, in this case, his emotions led him astray. His focus on Pompey's defeat overshadowed the bigger picture. He could have solidified his power in Egypt, a key player in the region, well before Cleopatra rose to prominence. But instead, Caesar let his personal goals and ambitions take precedence over a potentially game-changing military decision. At the time, Egypt was a rich, politically unstable kingdom, strategically located and ripe for conquest. Yet Caesar's relentless pursuit of Pompey turned into a delay. His military campaign, motivated by revenge for his former allies' betrayal, led to a delayed military response to the Egyptian situation. While Caesar continued to chase Pompey, Egypt was slowly being pulled into the political intrigue that would later change the trajectory of Roman history. Here's a strange fact: had Caesar acted sooner and taken control of Egypt earlier, it could have become the heart of his empire, transforming the Mediterranean power balance even more dramatically. Instead, by the time Caesar engaged with Egypt, it was no longer just a land to conquer, but a tangled political mess. He was forced to work with Cleopatra, who, although an incredibly intelligent and influential queen, would complicate matters for Rome in ways that were unforeseen at the time. You might think the Romans had the power and resources to crush Egypt without hesitation, but what most don't realize is that Egypt, despite its internal chaos, had immense strategic value. It was an economic powerhouse with vast resources, and its proximity to the eastern trade routes could have provided Rome with even greater wealth and influence. Had Caesar moved quickly, Rome could have used Egypt's resources to its advantage, strengthening the empire at a time when political instability was beginning to plague Rome from within. This delay in conquering Egypt created a ripple effect, one that would ultimately influence Rome's future relationships with the region and lead to Egypt's involvement in the internal power struggles of Rome. The longer Caesar waited, the more tangled the political web became, ultimately complicating what could have been a swift annexation. It's easy to assume that the delay in Roman conquest was simply a failure to recognize opportunity, but it was more than that. Caesar's obsession with Pompey prevented him from seeing the bigger picture. leader. His failure to see the broader strategic importance of Egypt shows how personal desires and emotions can cloud a leader's judgment. The reality is that even a brilliant leader can make flawed decisions when personal vendettas take center stage. One rare and controversial fact: by focusing too much on Pompey and revenge, Caesar might have inadvertently set the stage for Cleopatra's eventual rise as a political force. Had he acted differently, Egypt's fate, and Rome's, might have been radically different. A political instability in Egypt, compounded by this delay, would lead to internal Roman struggles that would eventually destabilize the empire in ways no one could foresee. Rome eventually did conquer Egypt, but at a cost. The delay allowed Cleopatra's influence to grow and intertwine with Rome's political intrigue, affecting the future of the empire. Rome could have taken Egypt earlier, and in doing so it might have avoided some of the tensions that arose from Cleopatra's complex relationships with future Roman leaders. The lesson from this missed opportunity is clear. Sometimes a leader's inability to separate personal ambition from strategic goals can lead to a missed opportunity for greatness. Had Caesar taken Egypt when he had the chance, it would have been a far easier conquest and could have avoided many future conflicts. Instead, Caesar's failure to see beyond his personal desires and ambitions left Rome in a precarious position, facing complex political entanglements that could have been avoided. The missed opportunity in Egypt serves as a powerful reminder that timing and focus are crucial in military strategy. Had Caesar acted more decisively, he could have secured an even more powerful empire, one that might have outpaced the challenges that eventually led to Rome's decline. Why did Rome fail to conquer the Parthian Empire? In the ancient world, the Parthian Empire posed one of the greatest challenges to Roman expansion. Despite their overwhelming military power and advanced tactics, the Romans were stymied by the Parthians, and the reasons for this failure have often been misunderstood. Most people think that the Roman legions were invincible, but the reality is that their downfall in Parthia was a combination of poor intelligence, strategic blunders, and failure to adapt. The Parthian cavalry, especially their horse archers and cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry, were the key to their superiority on the battlefield. When the Romans ventured into Parthian territory, they underestimated these cavalry units, which were able to strike from a distance and retreat before the Roman legions could effectively retaliate. Here's a surprising fact: despite their highly disciplined legions, the Romans never fully adapted to facing such cavalry. They relied heavily on close-quarters combat and heavy infantry, which had proven successful on countless occasions in the West. But in the Parthian East, these tactics were less effective. This tactical blind spot made Rome vulnerable when facing the Parthians. The Romans made a critical error by not securing proper intelligence about Parthian strategies. They entered enemy territory without a clear understanding of the terrain or the strengths of the Parthian forces. The Parthians exploited this weakness by ambushing Roman forces, drawing them into unfavorable situations. Now, Rome's failure to maintain its supply lines only worsened their position. When they were cut off and surrounded, the Roman legions found themselves unable to retreat, and their morale took a hit. But this wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a failure of leadership. The Roman commanders underestimated their enemies and failed to properly assess the risks of overextension. They were so focused on their military might that they didn't adjust their strategies to account for the Parthians' highly mobile cavalry and complex terrain. The Roman leadership also ignored the advice of scouts and soldiers, which would have given them the critical insight needed to avoid disaster. Freed from Parthia, after suffering heavy losses, exposed the underlying weaknesses in Roman tactics. The legions were forced to march across the unforgiving desert, which further depleted their strength and morale. The Parthians, with their greater knowledge of the region, were able to take full advantage of the Roman army's disarray, attacking during their retreat and leaving the Romans unable to regroup effectively. One rare and little-known fact: the Parthians didn't just fight with their cavalry, they also employed clever psychological warfare. The Parthian archers would engage in rapid-fire tactics, making it difficult for the Romans to pin down a target, forcing them to wear out and exhaust their forces over time. Roman soldiers, typically trained for hand-to-hand combat, found it nearly impossible to engage the Parthian forces in the open terrain. What should have been a straightforward conquest turned into an exhausting and humiliating failure for Rome. This defeat was particularly significant because it marked the end of Rome's eastern expansion. After this retreat, Rome would focus less on direct conquest and more on defending its borders. The failure to conquer the Parthian Empire is a pivotal moment in Roman history, illustrating that even the mightiest military empire can fall when it underestimates its enemies and overextends itself. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of this failure was Rome's refusal to adapt. The Roman military had a rigid structure and tradition that had served them well in Europe, but the Parthian challenge exposed how vulnerable these strategies were when they clashed with different kinds of warfare. The Romans, with all their resources and military strength, were brought low not by an enemy more powerful, but by their failure to evolve. The lesson here is clear: the inability to gather proper intelligence, to understand the enemy, and to adapt to changing circumstances can spell disaster, even for the greatest of empires. Rome's failure in Parthia wasn't due to a lack of resources or strength. It was because of their failure to listen, to learn, and to adjust. This one setback altered the course of history, showing that even the most powerful civilizations must remain flexible or risk collapse. The inability to conquer Parthia left a lasting impact impact on Roman strategy. As they continued to expand in other regions, Rome had to learn the hard way that their military might could be countered, not just by brute force, but by tactics that targeted their weaknesses. This story of Roman failure serves as a stark reminder. No empire, no matter how great, is invincible without adaptability and proper intelligence. How did a clever siege tactic almost fail under Roman leadership? The Battle of Allia is one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history, yet it nearly slipped into disaster due to a critical mistake by Roman leadership. Julius Caesar, famed for his tactical brilliance, faced an unexpected and dire situation during the siege of the Gallic city of Alesia. His victory would secure Roman dominance over Gaul, but the outcome was far from guaranteed. The Romans had already surrounded the fortified city of Alesia, where the Gallic forces led by Vercingetorix were holed up. The siege itself was a marvel of Roman engineering. Two concentric walls, one for defense and one to prevent reinforcements from breaking through. The Romans had thought they were in control, yet unbeknownst to Caesar, a crisis was brewing just beyond his lines. What no one expected was the Gallic relief army rushing to the aid of their besieged comrades. As Caesar's forces held firm against the city's defenders, a second army appeared on the horizon, a massive force of Gauls intent on breaking the siege. With the Romans stretched thin, their lines would soon be tested to the breaking point. Most people think that Caesar's victory at Alesia was a clear-cut success, but the reality is much more complicated. Had the relief forces been better coordinated, they might have turned the tide of the battle. The Roman legions, although highly disciplined, were at risk of being encircled and overwhelmed. Caesar himself was in a precarious position. Resources were running low, and the defensive lines were on the verge of collapse. The fact that Caesar's forces were under siege from both inside and outside is a rare historical circumstance that many overlook. It was a full-scale battle of attrition, where both sides would try to outlast the other. Caesar's brilliant use of terrain and fortifications would prove critical, but it wasn't just about military strategy, it was about sheer nerve. Here's a fascinating detail. Caesar's use of cavalry in this battle was also a gamble. He had positioned his cavalry to harass the Gallic relief army, but if they were outflanked or overwhelmed, the Romans could have been forced to retreat in disgrace. The fate of the entire campaign hinged on a delicate balance between offensive and defensive tactics, and for a brief moment, that balance was in serious jeopardy. The battle was fought on the brink of disaster, yet it ended in victory for Rome. But here's the surprising truth. It wasn't Caesar's strategy that led to success, at least, not entirely. Luck played a significant role. Had the Gallic forces been better coordinated, or the weather less favorable, the outcome could have been vastly different. Caesar's leadership and quick thinking saved the day, but the Romans came alarmingly close to losing. What really makes Alesia remarkable is that it highlights the fine line between success and failure. The Roman victory was narrow, with Caesar's troops managing just enough to hold off the siege. His forces were exhausted, low on supplies, and stretched thin, yet Caesar's bold leadership and his ability to capitalize on every small advantage helped them secure the victory. The lesson here? Success in warfare isn't always about overwhelming force or brilliant tactics. It's also about being in the right place at the right time. Caesar's leadership was crucial, but had he faltered, had he failed to react swiftly to the changing tides of battle, this entire campaign might have ended in Roman humiliation. In the end, the battle solidified Roman control over Gaul. Caesar's quick thinking and ability to stay calm under pressure made the difference. But the reality of warfare is this: even the most brilliant strategies can fail if luck doesn't stay on your side. The Siege of Alesia is a testament to the razor-thin margins on which the fate of empires rests. This battle teaches us that even in moments of strategic brilliance, the cost of failure is incredibly high. Caesar's victory was more about avoiding disaster than achieving a flawless conquest. Honor that war is often a game of inches, where even the smallest misstep can lead to defeat. And sometimes, the difference between victory and failure is a matter of sheer luck. How did miscommunication lead to chaos in one of Rome's key battles? The Battle of Teutoburg is often overlooked in the grand narratives of Roman military history, but it provides a striking lesson on the perils of miscommunication and poor coordination. What could have been a crucial victory turned into a fiasco for the Romans, and the consequences were felt for years to come. The Roman legions were poised to face off against a force of Spanish tribes, and on paper, victory seemed certain. After all, Rome had the superior training, experience, and numbers, but it was precisely this overconfidence that set the stage for disaster. The Romans had suffered from a series of miscommunications prior to the battle. On the day of the confrontation, the commanders failed to relay key instructions to their units. Orders were either misunderstood or delayed, leading to confusion on the battlefield. Even the smallest lapse in communication had serious consequences. One of the most fascinating and frustrating events of the battle was the complete breakdown in the Roman command structure. The legions were spread thin, and because of the lack of clear centralized communication, each unit operated almost independently. This lack of coordination created gaps in their formation, which the enemy quickly exploited. It's hard to imagine how a disciplined army like Rome's could fail so spectacularly, but this wasn't just a matter of poor planning. The chain of command was chaotic, and it was made worse by the fact that many of the senior commanders were distracted, either by personal concerns or by petty infighting within their ranks. The result was a fragmented army, one that was ripe for defeat. Here's the kicker. Despite the failure. The Romans learned something incredibly valuable from this misstep. They realized that even the best trained army, with the most formidable warriors, could collapse without the foundation of strong communication. A single battle of miscommunication left the Roman forces retreating in disarray, and the repercussions of the battle lasted long after the dust had settled. A surprising fact about the Battle of Teutoburg is that it wasn't a lack of resources or strategy that doomed the Romans. It was the inability to work as a cohesive unit. In fact, when the soldiers fought individually rather than as part of a coordinated effort, their individual brilliance was rendered ineffective. The battle should have been a victory, but poor communication and lack of leadership turned it into a rout. The chaos wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Roman soldiers, who were usually known for their resilience and discipline, were left questioning the competence of their leaders. This breakdown in trust had lasting effects on the morale of the army and influenced future campaigns. The failure at Teutoburg teaches us a profound lesson. Even in military history, where brute strength and superior tactics usually take center stage, the smallest failure in communication can unravel the entire strategy. It wasn't just about poor orders. It was about not having a clear, unified vision of how to fight the battle. As a result, what could have been a decisive Roman victory became a textbook example of how an empire's own inefficiency can lead to its downfall. As much as the battle is remembered for this miscommunication, it's also a reminder that wars are not just fought on the battlefield, but also in the minds of the soldiers. A lack of clear communication can chip away at the morale of even the most elite forces, and in this case, it did just that. The failure at Teutoburg wasn't Rome's greatest military loss, but it certainly highlighted the vulnerabilities that even the most powerful empires have. A communicated battle plan and misaligned forces can cause chaos, something that the Roman legions, with all their might, had never truly faced before. So what's the takeaway here? Rome's overwhelming power could not make up for the simple lack of communication. Even the mightiest legions are only as strong as the lines of command that hold them together. It's a lesson not just for the ancient world, but for any organization, military or otherwise, that relies on clear, concise communication to function effectively. And the Romans paid a heavy price for learning that the hard way. Was the Roman victory at Zama inevitable, or were they lucky? The Battle of Zama, fought in 202 BCE, was the decisive confrontation between the Romans, led by Scipio Africanus, and the Carthaginians under the command of Hannibal Barca. This battle is often hailed as a brilliant Roman victory that ended the Second Punic War. But was it really due to Roman ingenuity, or did luck play a bigger role than history suggests? At the time, Hannibal's reputation was unrivaled, having famously crossed the Alps with his war elephants and defeated the Romans in several major battles. He seemed unstoppable. The Romans, meanwhile, had reinvigorated their ranks and were ready for one final push. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. Scipio Africanus's plan was daring, but it wasn't as flawless as it's often portrayed. He wisely adapted his strategy to counter Hannibal's unique tactics, especially his famous use of war elephants. Scipio positioned his troops in a formation designed to lure the elephants away from the Roman lines, which worked to great effect. However, the real turning point came not from Roman strategy alone, but from a mistake made by Hannibal. Hannibal, desperate to turn the tide of battle, had hoped that his war elephants would trample over the Roman soldiers, breaking their lines. But Scipio's formation, combined with a series of well-timed cavalry charges from his Numidian allies, neutralized the elephants. This early success wasn't enough to guarantee a Roman victory, but it gave Scipio the momentum he needed. The real twist came when Hannibal made a critical error. He failed to commit his full forces to the battle. Despite having his elite troops positioned strategically, he hesitated to launch a decisive attack. His own leadership became a factor in his downfall. Scipio, on the other hand, acted swiftly, capitalizing on Hannibal's indecisiveness and exploiting every weakness in his opponent's position. Another key moment of luck was the timely arrival of Scipio's cavalry. The Romans, though seemingly at a disadvantage in terms of numbers, had the edge in cavalry, and this proved decisive in the battle's final stages. Scipio's forces surrounded Hannibal's troops, forcing them into a retreat and ultimately shattering Carthage's ability to wage war on Rome. What's fascinating about this victory is that while Scipio's tactical genius played a large part, the role of luck cannot be ignored. Had Hannibal been more decisive, or had his war elephants performed as expected, the outcome could have been very different. The Romans didn't necessarily outsmart Hannibal in every respect. They simply capitalized on the moments when fate was on their side. Most people think the Battle of Zama was a brilliant stroke of Roman military genius, but the reality is that it was as much about fortune as it was about skill. Certainly deserves credit for his strategic planning, but the ultimate victory came down to a series of fortunate events, moments of hesitation by Hannibal, and the unexpected success of Roman cavalry. It's easy to think of history's great battles as clear-cut triumphs of strategy, but when we dig deeper, we often see that luck plays a significant role. In Zama, luck was the deciding factor in the Romans' victory. Scipio's decision-making, combined with Hannibal's uncharacteristic missteps and the cavalry's timely intervention, meant that the Romans emerged victorious, but not necessarily because they were the superior force. The Battle of Zama marked the end of Hannibal's war in Italy and solidified Roman dominance in the Mediterranean. But this victory wasn't as inevitable as it may seem. The Romans, in the end, were victorious, but only just. us. It's a reminder that sometimes, even in the world's greatest military campaigns, success hinges on the smallest of factors, and history is often shaped as much by luck as by strategy. So, was the Roman victory at Zama inevitable? It was a mixture of clever tactics, a bit of fortune, and some key mistakes from Hannibal himself. History may remember it as a brilliant Roman triumph, but in reality, it was a close-run thing, one where luck and timing played a much larger role than most would like to admit. Was the fall of the Roman Empire really a military blunder? Most people associate the fall of the Roman Empire with military defeats, barbarian invasions, and the crumbling of its once great legions. But the truth might surprise you. The end of Rome was less about military blunders and more about internal struggles, corruption, and political mismanagement. In fact, the decline was a slow unraveling of an empire that had become too large, too complex, and too divided to maintain the strength it once had. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire controlled vast territories stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. But by the 5th century, things had begun to change. The Roman military, once the most powerful force in the world, was increasingly stretched thin across an empire that was constantly under siege. As barbarian tribes like the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns pushed on Rome's borders, it wasn't just the military that faltered. The very foundation of Roman society was crumbling from within. The fall of Rome wasn't caused by one catastrophic battle. It was the result of centuries of internal strife, economic decline, and the erosion of Roman ideals. The Roman military, once the backbone of the empire, had grown weak, not because its soldiers were less skilled, but because it had become a tool of political power struggles. The empire's resources were diverted into wars of succession, and Rome's leadership became increasingly divided. The failure of internal governance was just as, if not more, destructive than any military failure. Let's start by looking at the core of the empire's downfall, its internal struggles. By the 3rd century, Rome was experiencing political chaos. The once unified imperial system was now fragmented, with generals regularly overthrowing emperors and taking control. Emperors were often selected by the military rather than by a clear succession, leading to instability. The political structure that had once held the empire together was now its greatest vulnerability. Moreover, the division of power played a huge role in weakening the empire. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian split the empire into two halves, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, which would later become the Byzantine Empire. While the eastern half thrived, the western part struggled with financial difficulties, poor leadership, and constant invasions. This division weakened the empire's ability to respond to threats in a coordinated manner, making it harder for either side to effectively govern or defend the empire as a whole. Now let's address the real controversial point. Many argue that it wasn't military blunders but corruption and poor leadership that led to Rome's downfall. Yes, the Romans were under constant attack from barbarian groups, but the empire had always faced threats. The difference was that Rome's internal structure had become so corrupt and inefficient that it could no longer respond effectively to those external pressures. Take the economic decline, for example. At its peak, Rome had a thriving economy based on agriculture, trade, and a solid tax system. But by the 5th century, Rome's economy was in shambles. Inflation soared, the value of currency plummeted, and the empire struggled to fund its military, which was growing less effective due to constant internal squabbles and corruption. As the government's ability to fund its military weakened, Rome relied more heavily on mercenaries, who were often less loyal and more motivated by money than by allegiance to the empire. Perhaps the most critical factor in Rome's collapse was the lack of strong leadership. By the time of the fall, Rome was led by weak and often incompetent emperors who failed to make the tough decisions necessary for survival. Emperors like Honorius and Valentinian III were unable to maintain control over the western part of the empire. Instead of unifying the empire, they allowed local leaders to grow in power, further dividing Rome into competing factions. In fact, many of the barbarian invasions were not as spontaneous as history suggests. Some were the result of failed Roman policies. For example, the Visigoths under Alaric didn't just invade because they wanted to. They were pushed to do so by the Roman Empire's failure to treat them with respect. For years, the Romans had mistreated these barbarians, who had been used as mercenaries and soldiers in Roman army. When they were denied the land they had been promised, the Visigoths decided to take matters into their own hands and laid siege to Rome in 410 AD. And even the infamous sack of Rome in 476 AD wasn't so much the end of the empire, as it is often portrayed, but a symbol of its deep internal dysfunction. The last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a mere puppet ruler, incapable of holding any real power. The general Odoacer, a Germanic leader, deposed him, not because he wanted to conquer Rome, but because he knew the empire had collapsed under its own weight. By this time, the Western Roman Empire was already a shell of its former self. So, was the fall of Rome really a military blunder? The answer is complicated. Yes, there were military defeats, but those were symptoms of a much larger problem. The root cause was Rome's internal decay, corruption, political infighting, and a failure to adapt to the changing world. Collapse was not due to a single battle or invasion, but to the collapse of the very structures that once made Rome so powerful. Ultimately, it wasn't a matter of military defeat, it was a failure of leadership and governance. The barbarians may have sacked Rome, but they didn't cause its downfall. Rome's inability to govern itself, unite its people, and effectively lead its military to respond to external threats was the true reason for its fall. In the end, the fall of Rome reminds us that no empire, no matter how mighty, can endure without strong internal structures. A great empire's strength lies not just in its armies, but in its ability to adapt, govern, and maintain internal unity. The collapse of Rome shows us that even the mightiest can fall if they lose sight of the basic principles of governance and leadership. And sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from outside but from within. Did Nero's leadership failures contribute to Rome's downfall? When you think of the decline of the Roman Empire, the first images that come to mind might be military defeats or barbarian invasions. But what if I told you that some of the most critical mistakes came not on the battlefield, but from the very man tasked with leading the empire? Emperor Nero, often remembered for his cruelty and extravagance, was one of the most controversial figures in Roman history. His leadership, or lack thereof, played a key role in accelerating Rome's decline. Nero's reign began with promise. When he ascended to the throne at a young age, many believed he would restore stability to the empire. Early in his reign, advisors like Seneca helped guide him, and for a while, it seemed as though Rome was on a steady course. However, Nero's leadership would soon spiral into a series of disastrous decisions that had long-lasting consequences for the Roman Empire. One of the biggest issues with Nero's rule was his lack of focus on the military. The Roman Empire relied heavily on its military prowess to maintain control over its vast territories, but Nero, enamored with the luxuries of the imperial lifestyle, neglected his military obligations. He spent more time indulging in his personal passions, like performing in theatrical plays, than overseeing the strength and readiness of the Roman legions. As a result, the military's discipline and morale began to suffer. But it wasn't just his indifference to the military that contributed to Rome's downfall. Nero's refusal to listen to his advisors and military leaders created chaos at the highest levels. His advisors, like Seneca and Burrus, tried to steer him toward more reasonable decisions, but Nero's paranoia and thirst for power led him to dismiss them. In fact, he is believed to have had Seneca and Burrus eliminated to remove any opposition to his rule. As Nero became more erratic, the empire suffered from a lack of coherent leadership. Perhaps one of the most infamous episodes of Nero's reign was his role in the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire ravaged much of the city, leaving tens of thousands homeless. While rumors spread that Nero had started the fire himself to clear space for his lavish palace, the truth remains unclear. What is certain, however, is Nero's poor response to the disaster. Other than rallying the people or providing aid, Nero reportedly played his lyre while watching the city burn. His callous indifference further alienated him from the Roman people. Nero's incompetence extended to his military leadership as well. One of his greatest failures came when he faced the rebellion of the Jewish people in Judea. The First Jewish-Roman War, also known as the Great Jewish Revolt, started in 66 AD, and instead of quelling the rebellion swiftly, Nero appointed poor generals to deal with the threat. By the time Vespasian, one of Nero's generals, was able to take control of the situation, the rebellion had already cost Rome thousands of lives and valuable resources. Meanwhile, Nero's continued focus on lavish public aims, extravagant buildings, and personal indulgences drained the empire's coffers. The empire's economy, which had once been strong, now faced inflation, food shortages, and mounting debt. Nero's spending habits not only weakened the empire economically, but also strained the loyalty of the military. Soldiers were left unpaid and demoralized, and many began to question the stability of Nero's reign. Nero's leadership failures were not limited to his personal indulgences and poor military decisions. His reign also saw the rise of dangerous political factions within the empire. The Praetorian Guard, which had once been a reliable protector of emperors, became more politically involved under Nero's rule. At one point, the Guard even rebelled against Nero's leadership, making it clear that the emperor's authority was waning. As rebellions and unrest spread throughout the empire, Nero's power grew increasingly tenuous. In the final years of his reign, Nero's mismanagement of both the empire and his own leadership became too much to bear. In 68 AD, a military revolt in Gaul, combined with a series of internal power struggles, forced Nero to flee Rome. His reign ended not with a grand military battle, but with his own suicide. Nero's downfall wasn't just a result of external forces, it was a culmination of his own leadership mistakes, poor governance, neglect of military needs, and an inability to maintain control over his own court. Nero's actions during his reign show how disastrous poor leadership can be for even the greatest empires. While some Roman emperors like Augustus and Trajan managed to maintain stability through competent rule, Nero's erratic behavior exposed the cracks in Rome's political and military structures. His reign left a weakened empire, vulnerable to future invasions, internal corruption, and civil unrest. By the time of his death, the Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse, and it would take decades for the empire to regain its footing. But here's the truly controversial aspect of Nero's reign. Many argue that it wasn't just the military failures or rebellions that led to his demise. It was his disregard for leadership and the responsibilities that came with ruling an empire. The greatest mistake of all wasn't military. It was Nero's failure to understand the importance of leadership beyond the battlefield. The lessons from Nero's reign are stark and clear. Leadership is not just about making military decisions or engaging in grand spectacles. True leadership requires self-discipline, listening to advisors, managing resources wisely, and above all, maintaining the respect and loyalty of those you lead. Nero's fall shows us that without these qualities, even the most powerful empire can crumble from within. Nero's legacy, though often overshadowed by his infamous actions, is a reminder of the importance of responsible leadership in shaping the fate of nations. His reign serves as a cautionary tale that even empires built on military might can fall when led by individuals who fail to understand the true nature of governance. It's not just the external threats that can tear down an empire, it's the internal failures that can make a once great civilization collapse. So was Nero's leadership one of the greatest mistakes in Roman history? The answer seems clear. It was a catastrophic series of blunders that not only doomed his reign but contributed to the eventual decline of the Roman Empire. His inability to govern wisely and his neglect of both the military and the needs of the empire show us that leadership failures, no matter how grand or small, can have lasting consequences on the course of history. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.